So the gradual training appears to be the curriculum for the monks and nuns in the Buddha's dispensation. When you became a monastic under the Buddha, these were the practices you were to undertake. And they're highly relevant to lay people as well. When I went on my first month-long retreat with my teacher, Ayya Khema, I've been practicing for 6 years. And I had some idea of what this meditation, Buddhism stuff was about, but it was very disorganized. It was like I had a bunch of Post-it notes stuffed in an envelope. I didn't know what went where, how it related, anything like that. And when she taught the gradual training or a sutta on the gradual training for 25 days, I felt like I not only had a place to put all the notes, I could see how they all fit together. And it made a very coherent whole. And it's been really the basis of my practice ever since, and the basis of my teaching. There are 32 suttas that have at least some of the factors of the gradual training. I've managed to find those suttas, and it looks like there are about 30 different items. No sutta contains all the items. Some suttas have 4 or 5. A lot of them have like a dozen. But that's about the most. But other things show up only once or twice in the midst of stuff that's very common. So the sutta I want to share with you is the one that Ayya Khema taught me. It's the second discourse in the long discourses, the Samaññaphala Sutta, the discourse on the fruits of the spiritual life. And this particular sutta does contain more of the elements of the gradual training than any other sutta. There's other suttas that contain the same elements, but this one, it's got a great backstory as well as being a great teaching. So I'm going to give you what I got. I highly recommend that after we finish today, you go to suttacentral.org and find Bhikkhu Bodhi's translation and read the real thing, but I'm going to give you what I got. Thus have I heard. Once the Buddha was staying in Jivaka's mango grove with a company of 1,250 monks, just outside the great city of Rajagaha. At the time of this sutta, it was the full moon night, and King Ajatasattu, king of Magadha, was sitting on the upper terrace of his palace, surrounded by his ministers and other members of the court, including Jivaka, who had given the mango grove to the Buddha to serve as a monastery. Jivaka was the royal physician in King Ajatasattu's court. When the full moon rose, King Ajatasattu uttered a joyful exclamation. "Oh, what a beautiful night! Oh, what a wondrous night! Oh, what an auspicious night! Perhaps we could visit some recluse or Brahmin who could bring some peace to my mind." You see, King Ajatasattu had a very unpeaceful mind. This was because he had killed his father, good King Bimbisara. Bimbisara was actually one of the Buddha's first patrons, but he had a very ambitious son who eventually killed him so he could become king. And his father would not try and take the kingdom back. And so he had a very unpeaceful mind. He was plagued by nightmares. He'd no sooner fall asleep than he'd wake up screaming, and his servants would rush in. Great king, are you all right?" I'm fine, go away." And he'd go back to sleep and have another nightmare. So on this full moon night, the king doesn't want to go to sleep because he'll have a nightmare. And if the king can't sleep, nobody gets to sleep. So everyone is sitting up there on the palace with the king when he utters his joyful exclamation about wanting to visit some recluse or Brahmin who could bring some peace to his mind. And immediately one of the ministers piped up and said, "Great king, there's Puruna Kassapa. He's long gone forth. He has many followers. He's esteemed as holy. He's in the last stage of his life. You should visit him. Perhaps he can bring some peace to your mind." The king said nothing. Another minister piped up, "There's Makali Gosala. He's long gone forth. He has," you get the picture? Yeah. Each of the ministers, "Hey, my guy's a really good guy. You should visit him." And the king never said anything. He's just sitting there. When the hubbub finally died down, the king turned to Jivaka, who was nearby. "Jivaka, any recluse or Brahmin we might visit who could bring some peace to my mind?" "Great king, the Buddha, the perfectly awakened one, who teaches the Dhamma, which is good in the beginning, good in the middle, good in the end, is staying in my mango grove with a company of 1,250 monks. You should visit the Buddha. Perhaps he can bring some peace to your mind. Prepare the elephant vehicles, Jivaka." So Jivaka goes running down from the upper terrace of the palace, down to the stables below, and has 500 female elephants saddled up, and the king's royal bull elephant. And then he goes running back up to the king and says, "Great king, the elephant vehicles are prepared. Do as you see fit." So King Ajatasattu had 500 women of the court, seated one each on the 500 female elephants, and he and Jivaka mounted up on the royal tusker, and they rode forth in full royal splendor, with torchbearers going before. Must have been quite a sight on that full moon night. They rode out of the palace, and then through the city of New Rajagaha, and then through the old city and out the south gate, hung a left, and headed towards the mango grove. But when they got near the mango grove, it was quiet. It was a little too quiet. "Jivaka, are you betraying me? Are you turning me over to my enemies?" No, great king. Why would you think that? You said there's 1,250 people in this mango grove. I don't hear a sound. They're probably all meditating, great king. Look, you can see lights in the pavilion hall. Go forward, great king, go forward. So they went as far as they could go on the elephants, and they dismounted, the king and Jivaka and all the women of the court, and they went into the pavilion hall. The king was rather impressed. Here's 1,250 people sitting there totally silent. Nobody's fidgeting. Nobody's coughing. It's really quiet and peaceful. "Which one's the Buddha?" "He's the one sitting at the back, facing everybody else." So the king wanders around, checking it all out. And eventually, when he's fairly close to the Buddha, he says, "Oh, if only my son, the prince, could enjoy peace such as this." The Buddha heard him and said, "Great king, do your thoughts follow your affection?" "Indeed they do, venerable sir. Indeed they do. I love my son, the prince, very much, and it would be wonderful if he could experience peace, such as the company of bhikkhus experiences." And then the king saluted the Buddha, saluted the monks, and sat down at one side. Sitting there, he said, "Venerable sir, may I ask you a question?" "Certainly, great king. Ask whatever you wish." "Venerable sir, in my kingdom, there are people who practice many different crafts. There are elephant trainers, horse trainers. There are camp marshals, swordsmen, spearmen, archers, commandos, chainmail warriors. There are bakers, butchers, cooks of all sort. There are farmers who grow the food. There are weavers. There are bathmen. There are statisticians, accountants, barbers, street sweepers, each practices a craft, and it's possible to see some fruit of their labor. Venerable Sir, can you point out any fruit of the spiritual life visible here and now? Great King, have you ever asked this question of any other recluse or Brahmin? Well, yes, actually, Venerable Sir, I've asked a half a dozen about this matter, but they just preached their doctrine at me. They never really got around to answering the question. It was like asking for a mango and being given a breadfruit, most unsatisfying. So I ask you again, Venerable Sir, can you point out any fruit of the spiritual life visible here and now? Great King, I will ask you a question. Answer as you see fit. Suppose in your kingdom, in your palace, there's a slave, a workman, who rises before you each morning, waits on you hand and foot all day, sees that your needs are met, doesn't go to bed until after you go to bed. Suppose this slave were to think, it is wonderful, it is marvelous, the destiny of meritorious deeds. For this King Ajatasattu is a man, and I am a man, and yet he enjoys the 5 strands of sense pleasures as though he were a god, while I wait on him hand and foot from morning to night. Perhaps I should do meritorious deeds. Great King, suppose that slave at some later point were to shave off his hair and beard and go forth from the home life to the homeless life. Upon hearing this, would you send your men saying, make that man come back and be my slave? Oh no, Venerable Sir. We would rise up before him. We would prepare a seat. We would see to his food, clothing, shelter, and medicinal requirements. We would provide righteous protection. Great King, is this not a fruit of the spiritual life visible here and now? Yes, yes, it is, Venerable Sir. Venerable Sir, can you point out any other fruit of the spiritual life visible here and now? Great King, I will ask you a question. Answer as you see fit. Suppose in your kingdom there's a farmer who toils in his fields from morning to night. And of course, at harvest time, he pays a large portion of his harvest as taxes to support the royal treasury. Suppose that farmer were to grow weary of paying taxes. Suppose he were to think, it is wonderful, it is marvelous, the destiny of meritorious deeds. For this King Ajatasattu is a man, and I am a man, and yet he enjoys the 5 strands of sense pleasures as though he were a god, while I toil in my fields from morning to night, and at harvest time the king takes a great portion of what I've harvested as taxes for his treasury. Maybe I too should do meritorious deeds. Great King, suppose at some later time that farmer were to shave off his hair and beard and go forth from the home life to the homeless life. Upon learning of this, would you send your soldiers saying, make that man come back and be a farmer so he can support the royal treasury? Oh no, Venerable Sir, we would rise up before him. We would prepare a seat. We would see to his food, clothing, shelter, and medicinal requirements. We would provide for him a righteous protection. Great King, is this not also a fruit of the spiritual life visible here and now? Yes, it is, Venerable Sir. Venerable Sir, can you point out any fruit of the spiritual life visible here and now, but more wondrous and more sublime than these? Listen, Great King, and pay attention. A Tathagata arises in this world, a fully awakened Buddha who teaches the Dhamma which is good in the beginning, good in the middle, good in the end. A householder or householder's child or other person hears the Dhamma and gains faith and thinks, household life is crowded and dusty. Going forth is free like the air. And then at some point, that householder or householder's child or other person shaves off hair and beard, puts on the ochre robe, and joins the Tathagata's order. Great King, when someone joins the Tathagata's order, they live restrained by the precepts, the rules of behavior. The first of these rules is I undertake the training to refrain from killing living beings. The second of these rules is I undertake the training to refrain from taking that which is not given. There are many rules, Great King. We're celibate. We tell the truth. We don't use harsh or abusive language. We try and be peacemakers. We don't engage in gossip or idle chatter. We don't take intoxicants. We eat only in one part of the day. We don't visit singing or dancing shows or adorn ourselves with perfumes or garlands. We don't sleep on high and luxurious beds. We don't handle gold or silver. We have many rules, Great King. These rules make it possible for us to live with our senses guarded. Upon seeing a sight with the eye, we do not grasp at the signs or secondary characteristics, lest evil, unwholesome states such as covetousness or grief overcome us. Upon hearing a sound with the ear, smelling a smell with the nose, tasting a taste with the tongue, touching a texture with the body, thinking a thought with the mind, we do not grasp at the signs or secondary characteristics, lest evil, unwholesome states, such as covetousness or grief, overcome us. By living with our senses restrained, it makes it possible to do the work of a recluse. We're able, when we do anything, to be mindful. Mindful when going forward, mindful when going back. Mindful when looking forward and mindful when looking back. Mindful when getting dressed and going on alms round. Mindful when eating, chewing, savoring, swallowing, tasting. Mindful when going to the toilet. Mindful when speaking and keeping silent. Mindful when walking, standing, sitting, and lying down. Mindful when falling asleep. Mindful when waking up. Great King, we also have very few needs. We need only food, clothing, shelter, and medicine if we're ill. We're contented with little. This makes it possible for us to go wherever we want, like a bird on the wing. With these noble precepts, this noble guarding of the senses, this noble mindfulness, and this contentment with little, upon returning from alms round, having eaten the midday meal, one resorts to a secluded dwelling, an empty hut, the forest, the root of a tree, a hillside cave, the charnel ground, a heap of straw, the open air. One sits down cross-legged, holds one's body erect, and sets up mindfulness before oneself. Great King, when practicing meditation like this, 5 states of mind can arise that hinder progress on the spiritual path. The first of these is sensual desire. Sensual desire is like being in debt. If someone is in debt, they must continually work to pay off that debt. It's the same with sensual desire. No sensual desire is ultimately satisfying. It only leads to wanting more sense pleasures. But if someone were to pay off a debt, they would rejoice and become glad. If someone can overcome sensual desire, even temporarily, they rejoice and become glad. The second of these hindrances, Great King, is ill will and hatred. Ill will and hatred is like being physically ill. If someone is physically ill, they don't feel well. They can't think straight. They're hot. They can't do what they want to do. If someone is overcome with ill will and hatred, they don't feel well. They can't think straight. They're hot. They can't do what they want to do. But if someone who is ill were to take medicine and overcome that illness, they would rejoice and become glad. If one can overcome ill will and hatred, even temporarily, one rejoices and becomes glad. The third of these hindrances, great king, is sloth and torpor. Sloth and torpor is like being in prison. If someone is in prison, they just sit there missing out on all the good things of life. If someone is overcome with sloth and torpor and tries to meditate, they just sit there missing out on all the good things of the spiritual life. But if a prisoner were to be released from prison, he would rejoice and become glad. In the same way, if one can overcome sloth and torpor, even temporarily, one rejoices and becomes glad. The fourth of these hindrances, great king, is restlessness and remorse. Restlessness and remorse is like being a slave. A slave is always busy, but busy doing what the master commands. Go there, do that. Come here, do this. Never getting to do what the slave wants to do. It's the same with restlessness and remorse. The mind is all over the place, or the body can't get settled, and the practitioner can't do what they want to do. But if a slave were to gain his freedom, he would rejoice and become glad. In the same way, if someone can overcome restlessness and remorse, even temporarily, they rejoice and become glad. The fifth of these hindrances, great king, is skeptical doubt. Skeptical doubt is like being on a perilous desert journey where bandits abound and provisions are scarce. First one thinks, we'll go this way, but no, they're bound to be bandits. Better to go this way, but no, there won't be any water. One does more starting and stopping than actual progressing. It's the same thing with skeptical doubt. First, someone does this practice, but it's kind of boring, so they switch to this practice, but it's a little too baroque, and more starting and stopping than actual progressing. But if someone on a perilous desert journey were to arrive at a place of safety, they would rejoice and become glad. In the same way, if one can overcome skeptical doubt, even temporarily, one rejoices and becomes glad. When one sees that these 5 hindrances are not abandoned, one regards them as being in debt, as being physically ill, as being in prison, as being a slave, as a desert road. But when these 5 hindrances have been abandoned, one regards that as freedom from debt, good health, release from prison, freedom from slavery, as a place of safety. Thus secluded from sense desires, secluded from unwholesome states of mind, one enters and remains in the first jhana, which is with thinking and examining, and contains rapture and happiness born of seclusion. One drenches deep, saturates and suffuses one's body with the rapture and happiness born of seclusion, so there is no part of one's body not filled with rapture and happiness. Great king, imagine a skilled bath attendant or his apprentice taking a metal basin and pouring in just the right amount of water and then just the right amount of soap flakes and mixing the soap flakes and water until he has a homogeneous ball of soap. In the same way, one drenches deep, saturates and suffuses one's body with the rapture and happiness born of seclusion, so there is no part of one's body not filled with rapture and happiness. Great king, this is the fruit of the spiritual life, visible here and now, and more wondrous and more sublime than the previous. Further, great king, with the fading away of thinking and examining, and by gaining inner tranquility and unification of mind, one enters and remains in the second jhana, which does not have thinking and examining and has rapture and happiness born of concentration. One drenches deep, saturates and suffuses one's body with the rapture and happiness born of concentration, so there is no part of one's body not filled with rapture and happiness. Great king, imagine a lake far up in the mountains where there are no streams that come in and not even showers of rain, yet at the bottom of the lake there's a spring of cool, clear water. The cool, clear water would totally permeate the lake, totally fill the lake, so there would be no part of that lake not touched by the cool, clear water. In the same way, great king, One drenches, steeps, saturates, and suffuses one's body with the rapture and happiness born of concentration, so there is no part of one's body not filled with rapture and happiness. Great King, this too is a fruit of the spiritual life, visible here and now, more wondrous and more sublime than the previous. Further, Great King, with the fading away of the rapture, and by remaining imperturbable, mindful, and clearly aware, one enters and remains in the third jhana, of which the noble ones declare, happy is one who is equanimous and mindful. One drenches, steeps, saturates, and suffuses one's body with a happiness free from rapture, so there is no part of one's body not filled with happiness. Great King, so imagine a lotus pond where there are lotuses that come up out of the mud, but not above the surface of the water. They would live their whole lives filled with water from their tips to the roots. In the same way, one drenches, steeps, saturates, and suffuses one's body with the happiness free from rapture, so there is no part of one's body not filled with happiness. Great King, this too is a fruit of the spiritual life, visible here and now, more wondrous and more sublime than the previous. Further, Great King, the passing of pleasure and pain, as with the previous passing of joy and grief, one enters and remains in the fourth jhana, a state beyond pleasure and pain, which contains equanimity and mindfulness. One sits suffusing one's body with a pure, bright mind, so there is no part of one's body not suffused by the pure, bright mind. Great King, imagine a man covered from the head down by a white cloth, so that his body is totally suffused by the white cloth. In the same way, one sits suffusing one's body with a pure, bright mind, so that there is no part of one's body not suffused by the pure, bright mind. Great King, this too is a fruit of the spiritual life, visible here and now, and more wondrous and more sublime than the previous. Further, Great King, with a mind thus concentrated, clear, sharp, bright, malleable, wieldy, and given to imperturbability, one directs and inclines it to knowing and seeing. One understands thus, this is my body, made of material form, composed of the four elements, born of mother and father, fed on rice and gruel, impermanent, subject to rubbing and pressing, dissolution, and decay. And this is my consciousness, which is supported by it and bound up with it. Great King, insights into the nature of realities such as these are also fruits of the spiritual life, visible here and now, and more wondrous and more sublime than the previous. Further, Great King, with a mind thus concentrated, clear, sharp, bright, malleable, wieldy, and given to imperturbability, one can direct it and incline it to the various psychic powers. One can create a mind-made body. One can wield the supernormal powers, such as being one, becoming many, being many, becoming one, appearing and disappearing at will, walking on water, diving into the earth, passing through walls and ramparts unimpeded, flying cross-legged through the sky as though one were a bird, stroking the sun and the moon, wielding mastery over the body as far as the Brahma realms. One can also hear sounds at a great distance. One can know the minds of others. One can remember past lives. One can see beings passing away and re-arising according to their karma. Great King, psychic powers such as these are also fruits of the spiritual life, visible here and now, and more wondrous and more sublime than the previous. Further, Great King, with a mind thus concentrated, clear, sharp, bright, malleable, wieldy, and given to imperturbability, one can incline and direct it to overcoming the asavas, the intoxicants. One can understand this is dukkha. This is the origin of dukkha. This is the cessation of dukkha. And this is a path of practice that leads to the cessation of dukkha. One can understand these are the asavas, the intoxicants. This is the origin of the asavas. This is the cessation of the asavas. This is a path of practice that leads to the cessation of the asavas. And one can follow that path all the way to the end and put an end to the intoxicant of sense desire, the intoxicant of becoming, the intoxicant of ignorance. And in so doing, great king, one puts a final end to all dukkha. Great king, this too is a fruit of the spiritual life, visible here and now, and more wondrous and more sublime than the previous. Further, great king, there is no fruit of the spiritual life more wondrous and more sublime than this. The king was impressed. Wonderful, marvelous. It's like setting upright something that had been knocked down. It's like pointing out the way to one who is lost. It's like bringing a lamp into a darkened room so that those who have eyes can see. I go for refuge to the Buddha and to the Dharma and to the Bhikkhu Sangha. May the Buddha please consider me a lay follower from this day forth. And then King Ajatasattu got all shamefaced, and finally he blurted out, "Venerable sir, a transgression overcame me in that I killed my father, a righteous man and a righteous king. It is good that you admit such a transgression, great king, for the sake of your restraint in the future." And then the king said, "We must be going. We have many things to do." "Do as you see fit, great king." So the king saluted the Buddha, saluted the monks. Keeping the Buddha on his right, he circumambulated the Buddha, and then he and Jivaka and all the women of the court went back to where the elephants were parked, mounted up, and rode back to the palace. And not long after the king departed, the Buddha said to the monks, "This king has ruined himself. This king has destroyed himself. If he had not killed his father, a righteous man and a righteous king, then the stainless eye of Dhamma would have opened in him tonight, and he would have attained the first level of awakening. But this king has ruined himself. This king has destroyed himself." And the monks were very pleased with all that the Buddha taught. Now, the sutta ends here, but the commentaries go on to tell us that King Ajatasattu went back to the palace and had his first good night's sleep since his father died. And he did become a great protector of the Dhamma. 3 months after the Buddha's death, there was the first Buddhist council of 500 fully awakened disciples of the Buddha who came together to meet in a cave just outside the city of Rajagaha. They obviously felt they were safe under the protection of King Ajatasattu. But King Ajatasattu was a very ambitious man, and after the Buddha's death, he set out on wars of conquest, conquered all of the neighboring kingdoms and republics, and built the nucleus of the first great Indian empire. But not all went well for King Ajatasattu. You see, his son killed him. And his grandson killed his son, and his great-grandson killed his grandson, and his great-great-grandson killed his great-grandson. And at that time, the people of Magadha said, "Enough of these father killers." They killed the last of the line and established a new dynasty. So, did you notice that the Buddha's teaching was on Sila, Samadhi, Panya? Morality, concentration, wisdom. That's what the gradual training is about. And we'll go into each of these things of hearing the Dhamma, gaining faith, going forth, or in our case, committing to practice, keeping the precepts, guarding the senses, being mindful, being content with little, abandoning the hindrances, practicing the jhanas, doing insight practice, psyche powers. We'll talk about the psyche powers, but yeah, I'm not going to tell you how to do them. and overcoming the asavas. That's the gradual training.